Fyodor Dostoevsky constructed what might be the most penetrating analysis of human consciousness ever written. Born in 1821 in Moscow, he argued that humanity suffers from a fundamental split between reason and desire, between what we know and what we want. Our capacity for rational thought coexists with irrational drives that refuse logical constraint, creating an organism psychologically designed to torment itself through awareness of its own contradictions. Dostoyevsky identified the underground consciousness as the defining condition of modern humanity, where heightened awareness produces paralysis, where intelligence generates suffering, and where freedom itself becomes a curse rather than a blessing. His work anticipates contemporary debates in existential psychology, free will, and the problem of consciousness. This exploration examines Dostoevsky's complete philosophical architecture and its profound implications for how we understand what it means to be human. Before we go further, if you're enjoying these philosophical journeys, I'd love if you could tap that like button or maybe hit subscribe. It really does help more than you'd think. I'm always curious too. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop a comment with your city, what time it is there. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe, connecting through these ideas. Now get yourself comfortable. Maybe dim those lights. Turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why Dostoevsky believed that consciousness itself might be humanity's greatest burden. Part 1. The Underground Man. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground presents the first fully articulated portrait of hyperconscious modern humanity. The unnamed narrator embodies consciousness turned against itself, awareness that has exceeded its own utility. He's not mad in any clinical sense. He's perfectly lucid, brutally honest, and precisely because of this lucidity and honesty, he's utterly paralyzed. The Underground Man represents what happens when rational consciousness achieves full self-transparency without finding anything worth believing in. He sees through everything, including himself, and this seeing through leaves him with nothing to stand on. The opening declaration sets the tone for everything that follows. I'm a sick man. I'm a spiteful man. I'm an unattractive man. This isn't confession seeking sympathy or self-flagellation hoping for contradiction. It's clinical self-diagnosis delivered with almost scientific detachment. The Underground Man analyzes himself as a pathological specimen, and what he discovers is that consciousness itself, when sufficiently developed, functions as disease. Not metaphorical disease, but actual dysfunction that prevents normal human operation. The distinction between the man of action and the man of consciousness reveals Dostoevsky's core insight about modernity's psychological condition. The man of action encounters an insult, feels rage, and takes revenge. The process flows naturally from stimulus to response without internal interruption. But the conscious man encounters the same insult and begins thinking. He analyzes the insult from multiple perspectives, considers various responses, imagines consequences, questions his own motives for wanting revenge, doubts whether revenge will satisfy, and in this multiplication of perspectives, the natural flow from feeling to action breaks down entirely. By the time he's finished thinking, the moment for action has passed, and he's left with nothing but the residue of unexpressed emotion and the bitter awareness of his own paralysis. This isn't simple indecisiveness or cowardice. It's structural impossibility built into heightened consciousness itself. Every action requires some degree of certainty, some bedrock conviction that this action is the right one. But thorough consciousness undermines all certainty by revealing the arbitrary nature of any particular response. The underground man sees too many sides of every question, too many possible interpretations of every situation. This multiplication of perspectives doesn't enrich his experience. It paralyzes him completely. The toothache monologue demonstrates how consciousness transforms even physical pain into metaphysical problem. A normal person experiences toothache, suffers, and either endures or seeks treatment. The underground man experiences toothache and begins performing his suffering for an imaginary audience. He moans not from pain alone, but from awareness of his moaning, from spite toward those who hear him suffer, from perverse pleasure in making others uncomfortable. The pain becomes occasion for elaborate psychological theater, where every groan contains layers of intention, resentment, and self-mockery. Consciousness converts straightforward physical suffering into complex psychological game that has no winner. Dostoyevsky describes this as pleasure derived from the too intense consciousness of one's own degradation. This paradox defines the underground condition. Consciousness achieves such acuity that it begins feeding on its own dysfunction, finding a perverse satisfaction in articulating its own inability to function. The underground man doesn't just suffer from paralysis. He takes pride in his capacity to analyze that paralysis so precisely. His intelligence becomes both his prison and his consolation. He can't act like normal people, but he can understand why he can't act. And this understanding provides cold comfort even as it deepens his isolation. Søren Kierkegaard's concept of the aesthetic stage of existence provides illuminating parallel to Dostoevsky's underground consciousness. For Kierkegaard, the aesthete lives for immediate pleasure and interesting experience, treating life as spectacle to be consumed. But this aesthetic existence eventually collapses into despair because it lacks commitment to anything beyond momentary satisfaction. The aesthete becomes bored, ironic, detached, unable to invest genuinely in anything. Kierkegaard saw this as a preliminary stage to be overcome through ethical commitment and religious faith. But Dostoevsky's underground man has moved beyond Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage without arriving anywhere else. He's achieved the awareness Kierkegaard prescribed, recognized the emptiness of aesthetic existence, yet found no ethical or religious ground to stand on. He's suspended in permanent crisis, seeing through aesthetic postures without accessing authentic alternatives. Where Kierkegaard's framework promises progression through stages toward authentic selfhood, Dostoevsky suggests consciousness might get stuck permanently in this intermediate zone of self-aware dysfunction. The underground man's rejection of rational self-interest demolishes Enlightenment assumptions about human nature. He argues passionately against the idea that humans naturally pursue their own advantage once they understand what that advantage is. Rational egoism assumes that education and clear thinking will align human behavior with genuine self-interest. But the underground man insists that humans routinely act against their own interests, not from ignorance, but from perverse need to assert freedom. We want to prove that we're not merely calculating machines, optimizing for pleasure and avoiding pain. We'll act irrationally just to demonstrate that we can, that we're not determined by rational calculations. This connects to his famous declaration that twice 2 makes 4 is not life, but the beginning of death. Mathematical certainty, logical necessity, rational determination. These represent everything consciousness resists. If human behavior could be reduced to natural laws, if we were simply sophisticated mechanisms responding predictably to stimuli, then freedom would be illusion, and human dignity would collapse into mere biochemistry. The underground man refuses this reduction, even though he can't articulate what humans are if not rational calculators. He knows only that consciousness insists on its own irreducibility to system or formula. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment illuminates the underground man's psychology from a different angle. Ressentiment describes the psychology of those who lack power to change their circumstances and instead cultivate elaborate justifications for their weakness. They transform inability to act into moral virtue, celebrating their passivity as spiritual superiority. The slave morality Nietzsche described emerges from this creative revaluation, where weakness becomes strength and power becomes corruption. The underground man exemplifies ressentiment in crystalline form. He can't act effectively in the world, can't achieve success or respect or love. Rather than simply accepting this failure, he constructs elaborate philosophy explaining why action itself is beneath him, why men of action are stupid cattle, why his paralysis demonstrates superior consciousness. His spite toward active people masks envy he can't acknowledge. His celebration of consciousness disguises inability to do anything with that consciousness. Dostoyevsky saw this psychological mechanism with unflinching clarity decades before Nietzsche formalized the concept. But Dostoyevsky's analysis cuts deeper than Nietzsche's because it questions whether ressentiment can ever be overcome. Nietzsche prescribed self-overcoming, the cultivation of master morality that affirms life and power. But what if heightened consciousness necessarily produces ressentiment? What if you can't achieve Nietzschean self-overcoming without first reducing consciousness back to simpler, less self-aware state? The underground man's predicament suggests that once consciousness reaches certain threshold of self-transparency, it might be impossible to return to naive affirmation. The second part of Notes from Underground shifts from philosophical monologue to narrative illustration. The underground man recounts his humiliating attempts to connect with others, to participate in normal social life. Every encounter becomes disaster because he can't stop analyzing himself and others even while trying to interact naturally. He attends a farewell dinner for a former schoolmate, spends the entire evening oscillating between feeling superior to everyone present and feeling utterly degraded by his exclusion. He can't simply be present. He's always watching himself being present, judging his performance, and this meta-awareness destroys any possibility of genuine connection. His encounter with the prostitute Liza demonstrates consciousness's capacity to weaponize intimacy. He delivers an eloquent speech about the degradation of prostitution, convinces her she deserves better life, offers to help her escape. She's moved, grateful, begins to trust him. But the moment passes, and when she visits him later, he's overwhelmed by shame at his own poverty and circumstances. Rather than accepting her concern, he lashes out viciously, treating her exactly as her clients do, reducing the connection to transaction. Then he immediately regrets this cruelty, chases after her to apologize, but can't bring himself to actually apologize. The cycle of approach and retreat, connection and sabotage continues until Liza leaves forever. This pattern reveals consciousness's most devastating effect. It prevents not just action, but connection. The underground man desperately wants human contact, but can't stop performing and analyzing even in moments of potential intimacy. Every genuine emotion gets immediately observed, questioned, suspected of being performance. Is he really moved by Liza's situation, or is he enjoying the theatrical opportunity to play savior? Is his subsequent cruelty honest nastiness, or is it defensive reaction to vulnerability? He can't know, and not knowing, he can't commit to any response authentically. Consciousness creates infinite regress of self-questioning that makes genuine encounter impossible. Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith provides lens for understanding the underground man's self-deception. Bad faith involves lying to oneself about one's own freedom and facticity. We pretend we're free when we're determined, or pretend we're determined when we're free, avoiding responsibility for our choices by hiding behind false necessity. The waiter, who overperforms being a waiter, identifying completely with his role, exemplifies bad faith. He denies his freedom to be something other than waiter by throwing himself into the role as if it exhausted his being. The underground man's bad faith operates differently. He claims to embrace his freedom, to reject all social roles and expectations. But this very rejection becomes new form of bad faith. By identifying completely as the man who rejects identification, he locks himself into identity as thoroughly as any conventional person. His revolt against determination becomes its own form of determination. He can't escape bad faith because any stance he takes immediately becomes object of his own consciousness, revealing itself as chosen position rather than authentic truth. Bad faith isn't error to be corrected, but structural feature of self-conscious existence. Dostoyevsky thus presents consciousness not as tool for enlightenment, but as trap. The more aware we become, the less capable of simple, authentic action. The more we understand ourselves, the less we can trust any motive or feeling. The underground man's tragedy isn't that he's confused or ignorant. His tragedy is perfect clarity about his own condition, combined with absolute inability to change it. He sees the prison bars with perfect distinctness, precisely because those bars are made of seeing itself. Part 2. The Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor chapter from the brothers Karamazov presents Dostoyevsky's most concentrated philosophical statement about human freedom and suffering. Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual brother who can't believe in God despite wanting to, narrates a poem he's composed. In it, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles. The people recognize him, but the Grand Inquisitor has him arrested. In the prison cell, the Inquisitor delivers a monologue explaining why the Church must reject Christ himself. This monologue contains Dostoyevsky's complete analysis of human nature's relationship to freedom, authority, and happiness. The Inquisitor's central claim is that Christ made terrible mistake by respecting human freedom. Christ refused Satan's 3 temptations in the wilderness: turn stones to bread, throw yourself down, and let angels catch you. Bow to me and receive all kingdoms. Christ rejected these because accepting them would have meant compelling belief through miracle, mystery, and authority, rather than allowing free choice. But the Inquisitor argues that Christ thereby condemned humanity to unbearable suffering. Most people can't handle freedom. They don't want to choose. They want security, certainty, and someone to tell them what to believe and how to live. The Inquisitor claims the Church has corrected Christ's error. It has taken freedom away from people and given them happiness in return. Through ritual, hierarchy, and dogma, the Church provides what humans actually need: relief from the burden of choice, clear moral direction, and communal belonging. People are happier as obedient children than as free adults. The Inquisitor presents himself as tragic hero who recognizes this truth and accepts the burden of deceiving humanity for its own good. He lies to people about God and afterlife, but these lies purchase earthly happiness. He claims to love humanity more truly than Christ did because he accepts humans as they actually are, rather than as they might ideally become. This argument strikes at the foundation of Enlightenment humanism and liberal political theory. These traditions assume freedom is humanity's highest value, that autonomy and self-determination constitute human dignity. But what if most people don't want freedom? What if they prefer security and simplicity? What if the psychological cost of radical freedom exceeds what most humans can bear? The Grand Inquisitor forces confrontation with possibility that freedom might be curse rather than blessing, that those who grant freedom might be cruelest oppressors precisely because they refuse to protect people from freedom's weight. The three temptations correspond to three dimensions of human need. Bread represents material security. Miracle represents certainty in belief. Authority represents relief from decision-making. Satan offered Christ the tools to guarantee universal faith and happiness. Feed everyone, and they'll follow you. Prove your divinity through undeniable miracles, and doubt becomes impossible. Establish clear hierarchy of power, and people know their place without anxiety. Christ refused all three, insisting that genuine faith requires freely chosen in absence of compulsion. But the Inquisitor argues this produces only misery for those incapable of such faith. Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom provides 20th century psychological analysis that eerily echoes the Grand Inquisitor's argument. Fromm examined how Nazi Germany attracted mass support by offering to relieve people of freedom's burden. Modern freedom, he argued, creates psychological isolation and anxiety. As traditional structures of family, religion, and community weaken, individuals face terrifying question of what to do with their freedom. Many people respond by fleeing from freedom into authoritarianism, willingly submitting to strong leaders who promise security and belonging in exchange for obedience. Fromm distinguished between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from external constraints means little without positive freedom to create meaningful life. When people have negative freedom, but no clear conception of what to do with it, they experience that freedom as burden rather than gift. This explains totalitarianism's appeal. It transforms crushing responsibility of self-determination into comforting certainty of prescribed roles. The Grand Inquisitor understood this psychological mechanism centuries before modern totalitarianism demonstrated it historically. But does this mean authoritarianism is correct response to freedom's burden? Fromm argued that genuine solution lies in positive freedom, developing capacity for authentic creative relationship to self and world. People need not choose between anxious isolation and totalitarian submission. They can achieve mature freedom through love, productive work, and rational understanding. Dostoyevsky seems less optimistic. The Grand Inquisitor suggests that most humans will always choose security over freedom when forced to choose. That positive freedom might be possible only for exceptional individuals. Ivan's relationship to his own poem reveals Dostoyevsky's complexity. Ivan creates the Grand Inquisitor as mouthpiece for his own doubts about God and freedom. But he doesn't fully endorse the Inquisitor's position. He's fascinated and disturbed by his own creation. The Inquisitor speaks Ivan's unspoken suspicions that God, if he exists, has been cruel to create humans with freedom they can't handle, that a world containing innocent suffering can't be justified. But Ivan also recognizes the Inquisitor as monster, someone who has embraced deception and oppression as ultimate goods. This ambivalence defines Dostoyevsky's philosophical method. He never simply advocates positions. He creates characters who embody ideas with such force that the ideas become existentially real. The Grand Inquisitor isn't straw man easily defeated. He's tragic figure whose argument contains genuine insight, even as his conclusion horrifies. Dostoyevsky forces readers to struggle with the possibility that he might be right, that freedom might be too heavy for most humans, before allowing us to search for alternative responses. Christ's silent response to the Inquisitor's monologue demonstrates Dostoyevsky's ultimate answer without stating it explicitly. Christ says nothing throughout the entire accusation. At the end, he simply kisses the Inquisitor on his bloodless lips. The kiss burns in the old man's heart, but he still tells Christ to leave and never return. This silence and kiss contain Dostoyevsky's deepest insight about freedom and love. Some truths can't be argued, only witnessed. Some transformations can't be compelled, only offered. The kiss represents love that respects freedom absolutely. It doesn't refute the Inquisitor's arguments logically. It doesn't force him to believe or change. It simply offers itself as gift that the Inquisitor remains free to accept or reject. He rejects it, choosing to continue his project of controlled happiness rather than risk genuine freedom. But the kiss affects him despite his rejection. It introduces possibility he can't entirely dismiss, opens space for different response, even as he refuses to enter that space. Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy of the face provides framework for understanding Christ's silent witness. Levinas argued that encountering another person's face makes ethical demand that precedes all reasoning. The face says, "Do not kill me," addresses us from position of absolute vulnerability, and in that address establishes ethical relationship before any calculation of interests or rational justification. Ethics isn't derived from principles, but emerges from this primordial encounter with others' vulnerability. Christ's kiss functions like Levinasian face. It confronts the Inquisitor with vulnerability, with love that doesn't defend itself or argue for itself. This confrontation makes ethical demand without imposing obligation. The Inquisitor remains free to reject this demand, but he can't remain unaffected by having encountered it. The kiss reveals that freedom isn't primarily burden to be escaped, but capacity for response to call that comes from beyond our control. We're free not because we choose everything, but because we can respond to a dress that chooses us. The Grand Inquisitor's tragedy is that he has become incapable of response. He's locked himself into a system where all encounters are predetermined by his role. He can't receive the kiss as genuine gift because that would require acknowledging dimension of experience his entire project denies. He's made himself immune to transformation by insisting he already knows what humans need and how to provide it. His claim to love humanity more truly than Christ actually reveals his refusal of genuine love, which always risks being changed by its object. Dostoyevsky thus suggests that freedom's burden can't be eliminated, but can be transformed through love. Not sentimental emotion, but radical openness to other that risks self-transformation. The Grand Inquisitor's error isn't recognizing that freedom causes suffering. It's attempting to resolve that suffering through control, rather than through relationship. True response to freedom's weight isn't taking freedom away, but helping people bear it through connections that make bearing worthwhile. Part 3. The Problem of Suffering. Dostoyevsky's entire philosophical project centers on what he called the accursed questions about suffering's meaning and justification. If God exists and is both omnipotent and loving, why does he permit innocent suffering? Can any future harmony justify present anguish? Ivan Karamazov formulates this problem with such force that even believers struggle to answer him. His rebellion against God doesn't stem from disbelief in God's existence, but from moral rejection of any world order that requires innocent children's tears. Ivan's catalog of suffering focuses deliberately on children. He recounts story after story of child abuse, cruelty inflicted on those who can't possibly deserve punishment. A surf boy torn apart by hunting dogs because he accidentally injured one dog. A 5-year-old girl locked in outhouse all night by parents who smeared her face with her own excrement. These stories aren't fictional horrors, but documented cases from contemporary Russia. Ivan forces his brother Alyosha to confront concrete reality of innocent suffering rather than abstract theological concepts. The challenge isn't whether suffering exists, but whether it can be justified. Ivan imagines future harmony where all pain is redeemed, where eternal joy compensates for temporal anguish, where universal understanding reveals hidden necessity of every tear. Even granting this possible, he asks whether such harmony would be worth its price. If eternal bliss requires one tortured child, would you accept that bargain? His answer is no. He'd rather reject the entire system, return his ticket to paradise, than participate in cosmos built on such foundation. This rebellion operates at deeper level than atheism. Ivan doesn't claim God doesn't exist. He claims that even if God exists and offers eternal life, the terms are unacceptable. Any deity who structures reality so that innocent suffering serves larger purpose isn't worthy of worship. Ivan's position is moral protest against God's governance, not intellectual doubt about God's existence. This makes his rebellion more threatening to religious faith than mere unbelief, because it accepts theology's premises while rejecting its conclusions. Leibniz's theodicy represents classic philosophical attempt to justify suffering. Leibniz argued that God must have created the best of all possible worlds. Given logical constraints and necessity of creaturely freedom, this world with all its suffering is optimal. Every evil serves some greater good. Every pain enables some larger purpose. Alternative worlds might eliminate particular sufferings, but would introduce worse problems. God's benevolence doesn't mean absence of suffering, but rather minimal suffering necessary for maximal good. Dostoyevsky has Ivan demolish this theodicy, not through counter-argument, but through vivid presentation of what gets justified. When you see the torn body of actual child, claims about best possible worlds become obscene. Abstract logic that makes suffering necessary disguises reality that someone experiences that suffering concretely and irreplaceably. The child locked in darkness doesn't care about metaphysical optimization. Her terror and pain aren't redeemed by contributing to cosmic harmony. she'll never witness or understand. Ivan's rebellion reveals theodicy's fundamental problem. It requires adopting God's perspective, viewing suffering from outside and above rather than from within. We justify suffering when we imagine ourselves as judges evaluating whole system. But we exist as parts of that system, experiencing suffering directly. The attempt to justify suffering from God's perspective denies the only perspective we actually have, that of limited creatures who undergo pain without seeing its supposed purpose. Albert Camus's analysis of absurdity in the myth of Sisyphus extends Ivan's rebellion into existential territory. Camus argues that life confronts us with fundamental absurdity, the collision between human need for meaning and universe's indifference to that need. We demand explanations, justifications, purposes. Reality offers none. This absurdity creates philosophical problem. Should we accept absurd existence or rebel against it through suicide? Camus famously argues for rebellion without hope. We should acknowledge absurdity while refusing to escape through suicide or philosophical evasions. Sisyphus, pushing boulder eternally uphill, becomes hero precisely because he continues without illusion that his task has meaning. His rebellion consists of scorn for his punishment, clear-eyed awareness that his labor is futile combined with determination to continue anyway. But Dostoyevsky's Ivan can't accept Camus's heroic absurdism. For Ivan, the problem isn't just that life lacks meaning. It's that life contains suffering that actively demands justification. Camus's universe is indifferent, neither good nor evil. Ivan's universe appears malevolent, structured specifically to torture innocence. You can't rebel cheerfully against cosmos that torments children. The absurdist revolt works only if suffering is meaningless side effect. If suffering seems deliberately built into reality's structure, absurdist acceptance becomes complicity. The concept of moral evil versus natural evil complicates theodicy discussions in ways Ivan's examples exploit. Moral evil stems from human free will, cruelty we inflict on each other. Natural evil involves suffering from disease, disaster, natural processes. Theodicies often handle these differently. Moral evil gets justified through free will defense. God grants freedom, which enables evil, but is worth that cost. Natural evil gets explained through natural law. God creates ordered universe governed by principles that sometimes harm individuals. But Ivan's examples blur this distinction. The parents who torture their child exercise free will, but what kind of God creates beings capable of such cruelty? The surf boy, killed by dogs, suffers from human cruelty, but that cruelty operates within social system that God presumably permitted. Even natural evils often hurt innocents most. Children with cancer, babies born into famine. The neat theological distinctions collapse when confronting concrete suffering. Whether evil is moral or natural matters less than the fact that God, if omnipotent, could prevent it and doesn't. Marilyn Adams's work on horrendous evils attempts to formulate theodicy adequate to Ivan's challenge. Adams defines horrendous evils as suffering so severe that they threaten to make victims' life not worth living overall. Standard theodicies fail with horrendous evils because no conceivable future good seems proportionate to torture of innocent child. Adams argues that God must defeat horrendous evils not by justifying them through consequences, but by integrating them into relationship with divine love so intimate that suffering becomes occasion for union with God deeper than any other experience. This theodicy requires mystical dimension that Ivan explicitly rejects. Adams essentially claims that victim of horrendous evil will eventually experience relationship with God so profound that they'll recognize their suffering as having enabled that relationship. But this assumes consent from victim who never chose to suffer. It makes suffering instrumental to relationship when genuine love shouldn't require suffering as prerequisite. And it postpones redemption to afterlife that may not exist, offering future compensation for present agony. Ivan's rebellion ultimately rests on conviction that suffering of one innocent child can't be justified by anything. Not future harmony, not free will, not natural law, not mystical union with God. This isn't argument about whether suffering has explanation. It's moral judgment that some experiences are categorically wrong, regardless of explanation. Even if God explained why child's torture was necessary, even if we understood cosmic purpose, that wouldn't make it acceptable. Some evils are irredeemable, not because we don't know their purpose, but because no purpose could make them right. Dostoyevsky doesn't answer Ivan's rebellion through logical argument. The brothers Karamazov doesn't present theodicy that refutes Ivan's position. Instead, Alyosha's kiss, echoing Christ's kiss to the Grand Inquisitor, suggests different mode of response. Alyosha can't argue against his brother's logic. He can only offer presence, solidarity, love that doesn't claim to justify suffering, but simply stands with sufferers. This gesture implies that response to suffering isn't intellectual justification, but compassionate action. Part 4. Radical freedom. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, embodies Dostoevsky's analysis of modern nihilism taken to its logical conclusion. If God doesn't exist, if traditional morality lacks foundation, if humans are simply material beings without transcendent significance, then what prevents us from doing whatever we want? Raskolnikov develops theory that extraordinary individuals stand above common morality, that Napoleon's ability to kill thousands in service of his ambition demonstrates that power creates its own justification. He decides to test this theory by murdering a pawnbroker he considers worthless parasite. The murder itself occurs early in the novel, and the remainder follows Raskolnikov's psychological disintegration. He expected to feel liberated by transgressing moral law, to prove himself extraordinary through his willingness to kill. Instead, he experiences crushing guilt, paranoid anxiety, and gradual collapse of personality. The crime that should have demonstrated his freedom instead reveals his unfreedom. He can't escape moral categories he intellectually rejected. His consciousness won't let him rest in his transgression. This demonstrates Dostoevsky's argument about freedom's paradoxical nature. True freedom can't be achieved through transgression alone. Raskolnikov thought freedom meant liberation from moral constraints, ability to act without guilt. But conscience operates beneath conscious belief. You can't think yourself free of moral feeling any more than you can think yourself out of love or fear. The underground man discovered that consciousness paralyzes action. Raskolnikov discovers that action can't liberate consciousness from its own nature. The distinction between negative and positive freedom illuminates Raskolnikov's confusion. Negative freedom is freedom from external constraints, absence of coercion. Positive freedom is capacity for self-direction toward genuine goods. Raskolnikov achieves negative freedom through murder. He demonstrates that social and moral constraints can be violated. But this violation doesn't produce positive freedom because he has no conception of what he's free for. His freedom becomes abstract and empty leaving him more imprisoned than before. Nietzsche's concept of master morality seems superficially similar to Raskolnikov's theory of extraordinary individuals. Nietzsche distinguished between master morality that affirms power and slave morality that condemns it. Masters create their own values through their strength. Slaves invent morality to constrain and condemn masters. Nietzsche celebrated figures like Caesar and Napoleon, who transcended conventional morality through sheer force of will. This appears to justify exactly what Raskolnikov attempts. But crucial difference separates Nietzsche's philosophy from Raskolnikov's crime. Nietzsche's master doesn't transgress existing morality to prove his freedom. He creates new values through his very existence. The master isn't defined by opposition to slave morality, but by positive affirmation of life in all its aspects. Raskolnikov remains trapped in reactive relationship to morality he claims to reject. He defines himself through transgression, which means he remains dependent on the very moral framework he violates. True Nietzschean freedom wouldn't need to murder to prove itself. Dostoyevsky thus reveals nihilism's internal contradiction. Nihilism claims that nothing has inherent value or meaning, that we're free to create our own values. But this abstract freedom produces paralysis and destruction rather than creative flourishing. Without positive conception of human good, freedom becomes mere capacity for violation. Raskolnikov discovers he's still human after rejecting humanity's moral constraints. He can't remake human nature through intellectual decision. Simone Weil's concept of decreation provides alternative understanding of freedom's relationship to self. Weil argued that true freedom requires not assertion of will, but surrender of ego, destruction of self-centered perspective that treats personal desires as ultimate reality. We become free by recognizing our own nothingness before God, allowing divine love to work through us, rather than imposing our will on world. This radical passivity paradoxically enables genuine action because we act from something beyond our limited selves. Raskolnikov's crime represents exact opposite of Weilean decreation. He attempts to create himself as extraordinary through supreme assertion of individual will. But this assertion reveals that will, without ground, collapses into arbitrary violence. Weil would argue that Raskolnikov's freedom is actually slavery to ego, that his assertion of autonomy chains him more thoroughly than obedience to moral law would have. True freedom requires recognizing limits of individual will, accepting that we participate in reality larger than ourselves. Dostoyevsky's portrait of Sonia, the prostitute who loves Raskolnikov and leads him toward redemption, embodies alternative to his nihilistic freedom. Sonia has even less social freedom than Raskolnikov. She's forced into prostitution to support her family, has no education, no power, no respect. Yet she possesses something Raskolnikov lacks: genuine selfhood grounded in love and faith. Her apparent unfreedom doesn't destroy her humanity. She remains capable of compassion, forgiveness, and connection despite her degraded circumstances. The contrast suggests that freedom isn't primarily about external conditions or absence of constraints. It's about interior capacity for love and meaning. Sonia is more free while oppressed than Raskolnikov while killing. Her freedom comes from relationships that give her life direction and purpose. His unfreedom stems from isolation in his own consciousness, abstract theories that cut him off from human connection. The novel's conclusion shows Raskolnikov beginning to find freedom not through philosophical insight, but through accepting Sonia's love and her faith. Kant's moral philosophy provides framework Raskolnikov violates and discovers he can't escape. Kant argued that moral law is categorical imperative we recognize through pure reason. We should act only on maxims we could will as universal laws. We should treat humanity always as end in itself, never merely as means. These principles don't depend on consequences or feelings, but on rational recognition of what morality requires. Kant claimed moral law is self-evident to rational beings. Raskolnikov tests whether he can rationally reject moral law. He argues that exceptional individuals can treat others as means to their own ends, that universal principles don't apply to those strong enough to transcend them. But after murdering, he discovers that rational rejection doesn't eliminate moral sense. His guilt doesn't stem from fear of punishment, but from violation of something deeper than conscious belief. This suggests Kant might be correct that moral law operates at level beneath theoretical reasoning. But Dostoyevsky's position differs from simple vindication of Kantian ethics. Raskolnikov's salvation doesn't come through rational recognition of moral law. It comes through love, suffering, and gradual transformation of character. Reason alone can't restore him because reason led to his crime. He needs something beyond reason, personal relationship that reconnects him to human community he tried to transcend. Morality for Dostoevsky isn't primarily matter of rational principle, but of lived connection to others. Hannah Arendt's analysis of evil's banality provides troubling counterpoint to Dostoevsky's portrait of Raskolnikov's tormented conscience. Arendt studied Eichmann and other Nazi bureaucrats, expecting to find monsters, but discovering ordinary people who committed atrocities without experiencing guilt. They didn't struggle with conscience or suffer psychological disintegration. They simply followed orders, did their jobs, and slept well at night. This suggests conscience isn't universal guarantee against evil. Dostoevsky's faith in conscience's power might be historically naive. Raskolnikov can't escape guilt because he remains connected to humanity he tried to transcend. But what if someone succeeded in severing that connection? What if ideology or social conditioning could eliminate conscience effectively? The 20th century's totalitarian movements demonstrated that humans can commit mass murder without suffering Raskolnikov's torment. Perhaps conscience isn't bedrock of human nature, but fragile achievement easily destroyed. Yet Dostoevsky might respond that Eichmann and his kind represent not freedom from conscience, but successful repression of it. They didn't transcend morality, but buried it beneath layers of bureaucratic rationalization and ideological commitment. The banality of their evil reflects not absence of conscience, but effective mechanisms for avoiding moral recognition. They lived in bad faith, refusing to acknowledge what they were doing. Raskolnikov at least confronted his crime honestly, which explains why he suffered while bureaucratic killers didn't. Part 5. The Burden of Consciousness. Dostoevsky's characters repeatedly describe consciousness itself as illness, burden, or curse. The underground man calls it disease. Ivan Karamazov would return his ticket to paradise rather than accept consciousness's terms. Raskolnikov discovers that awareness of his crime won't let him rest. This persistent theme suggests Dostoevsky identified consciousness as fundamental human problem, not just moral failing or psychological weakness, but structural feature of modern existence. The burden appears in different forms across his work. Sometimes it manifests as paralysis, inability to act decisively. Sometimes as alienation, severing connection to others through excessive self-awareness. Sometimes as guilt, conscience that won't permit rest even when person has convinced themselves transgression was justified. Sometimes as meaninglessness, recognition that values and purposes are arbitrary constructions without foundation. In each case, consciousness creates distance from immediate experience, introducing reflection that disrupts natural flow of life. This distinguishes Dostoyevsky's analysis from religious or philosophical traditions that celebrate consciousness as humans' highest faculty. Plato identified nous, rational mind, as divine element that connects us to eternal forms. Christianity sees consciousness as bearing God's image, capacity for understanding, and moral choice. Enlightenment philosophy treats reason as tool for progress and emancipation. All assume consciousness enhances human life, that more awareness and clearer thinking improve existence. Dostoyevsky questions this assumption without rejecting it completely. He recognizes that consciousness enables moral understanding, artistic creation, genuine human connection. But he also sees that consciousness costs too much, demands too much, reveals too much. The characters with most developed consciousness suffer most acutely. Those with simple faith and limited reflection often live more happily. This creates terrible paradox. Consciousness is what makes us distinctively human, yet it might make distinctively human life unbearable. The connection to Schopenhauer's pessimism appears obvious, but requires careful analysis. Schopenhauer argued that will, blind cosmic striving, constitutes reality's essence. Consciousness emerges as will's self-awareness, which introduces suffering because will recognizes its own pointlessness. The more conscious a being, the more it suffers. Humans suffer more than animals because our consciousness is more developed. Philosophy and art provide temporary relief by allowing us to contemplate will without being entirely subject to it. Dostoyevsky knew Schopenhauer's work, but rejected his metaphysics while absorbing his psychological insights. For Schopenhauer, consciousness reveals that striving itself is problem. For Dostoyevsky, consciousness creates problem through its particular modern form. Pre-modern humans had consciousness without experiencing it as burden because they possessed stable religious and social frameworks that gave consciousness purpose and direction. Modern consciousness lacks these frameworks, creating the underground condition where awareness has nothing to anchor to. This suggests historical dimension to consciousness's burden. If problem is specifically modern, perhaps it can be overcome through recovering or creating new frameworks that give consciousness meaningful employment. The underground man suffers not from consciousness itself, but from consciousness without purpose. If purpose were restored, consciousness might cease being illness and become gift again. But how can purpose be restored once consciousness has seen through all purposes as arbitrary constructions? You can't return to naive faith after passing through radical doubt. Hegel's philosophy of history offers optimistic answer to this dilemma. Hegel argued that consciousness develops through dialectical process, where each stage of awareness generates contradictions that drive development to higher synthesis. Modern alienation and doubt represent necessary moments in consciousness's self-realization. Eventually, spirit achieves absolute knowledge, where subject and object consciousness, and reality fully recognize themselves as identical. Alienation gets overcome through complete self-understanding. Dostoyevsky seems to have found this Hegelian optimism unconvincing. His characters don't progress dialectically toward synthesis. They suffer in permanent contradiction without resolution. The underground man doesn't overcome his paralysis through higher consciousness. He simply continues analyzing his inability to act. Ivan doesn't reconcile his rebellion through philosophical development. He goes mad from unresolved tension between his intellect and his heart. Hegelian spirit marching toward self-realization doesn't match the phenomenology of actual conscious suffering. Martin Heidegger's distinction between present at hand and ready-to-hand modes of engagement illuminates different dimension of consciousness's burden. In ready-to-hand mode, we're absorbed in activity without reflective awareness. The hammer becomes extension of hand. The path home disappears into the walking. In present-at-hand mode, we step back and observe things as objects for theoretical contemplation. Heidegger argued that present-at-hand mode, while necessary for science and philosophy, represents derivative form of engagement that loses contact with reality's primordial disclosure. The underground man's problem is being trapped in present-at-hand mode continuously. He can't achieve ready-to-hand absorption in activity because consciousness constantly observes and questions his engagement. Every action becomes object for contemplation rather than lived experience. This permanent theoretical stance makes genuine dwelling in world impossible. He can't hammer without analyzing his hammering, can't walk without reflecting on his walking. Consciousness has become so dominant that immediate engagement has disappeared. But Heidegger's framework might miss something crucial about Dostoyevsky's analysis. The problem isn't just that modern humans are trapped in theoretical stance. It's that we recognize the arbitrariness and groundlessness of any stance. We can't return to ready-to-hand absorption because we've seen that such absorption rests on unexamined assumptions. The peasant absorbed in traditional life isn't more authentic than the underground man. He's simply unreflective. Once reflection begins, it can't be turned off without self-deception. Contemporary neuroscience of self-awareness provides different perspective on consciousness's burden. Default mode network activates during rest and mind wandering, generating self-referential thought. People with hyperactive default mode networks experience more rumination, anxiety, and depression. Meditation practices that quiet default mode network correspond with increased well-being. This suggests consciousness's burden has neurological substrate, that excessive self-awareness has measurable costs. But does neuroscience explanation help? Knowing that rumination involves specific brain networks doesn't resolve question of whether rumination reveals truths about existence that happier people simply avoid. Perhaps hyperactive default mode network enables recognition of realities that quieter networks miss. The underground man might have neurological predisposition to self-reflection, but that doesn't mean his self-reflection is pathological error rather than uncomfortable insight. Dostoyevsky's own epilepsy and near-execution experience informed his understanding of consciousness's fragility and burden. His epileptic auras produced moments of expanded awareness, feelings of absolute harmony and understanding that he described as worth entire lifetime of suffering. The mock execution, where he faced firing squad before being pardoned at last moment, gave him overwhelming sense of life's preciousness, combined with recognition of its absolute contingency. These experiences taught him that consciousness operates at multiple registers, that ordinary awareness is just one mode among others. This suggests consciousness's burden might be specific to ordinary waking consciousness, that altered states could provide relief without requiring unconsciousness. The moments of epileptic aura offered Dostoyevsky temporary escape from the grinding self-awareness that tortures his characters. But such moments are rare, uncontrollable, and leave no lasting transformation. They prove that other modes of consciousness exist without making them accessible as sustained alternatives. The underground man remains underground even after glimpsing higher possibilities. The question becomes whether consciousness's burden can be overcome or must simply be endured. Dostoyevsky offers no clear answer. His characters who find relief do so through love, faith, and human connection rather than through philosophical resolution. Alyosha's religious faith provides him stable ground that Ivan's intelligence can't access. Sonia's love enables her to bear degradation that would destroy Raskolnikov. But these solutions aren't available to everyone. You can't choose to believe, can't will yourself to love. Faith and love come, or they don't. For those who can't access them, consciousness remains unbearable burden without remedy. Part 6. The Problem of God. Dostoyevsky's relationship to religious faith might be most complex and fascinating aspect of his philosophy. He's often read as Christian apologist, defender of orthodox faith against modern atheism and nihilism. But his characters who question God speak more powerfully than those who defend him. Ivan's rebellion articulates doubts with such force that theological responses seem weak by comparison. The Grand Inquisitor's critique of Christianity cuts deeper than any refutation offered. This suggests Dostoyevsky struggled genuinely with faith rather than simply promoting it. The famous declaration in his letter that if someone proved to him that Christ was not the truth, he would rather remain with Christ than with the truth, reveals this struggle's depth. This isn't simple faith. It's acknowledgement that faith requires commitment beyond what evidence justifies. Dostoyevsky knows arguments for atheism might be stronger than arguments for God. He chooses Christ anyway, not from rational conviction, but from something deeper or more desperate. The choice reveals awareness that faith can't be intellectually justified, that it requires leap beyond what reason permits. His characters embody different positions in religious debate without any position being simply refuted. Ivan represents intellectual rebellion against God's justice. Alyosha represents simple faith, maintained through love rather than argument. Father Zosima represents mystical Christianity, emphasizing universal responsibility and joy. Smerdyakov represents nihilistic atheism taken to conclusion in murder. The novel doesn't resolve these positions into synthesis. They remain in tension, each capturing something true about human relationship to ultimate questions. This refusal of synthesis distinguishes Dostoyevsky from philosophical theologians who attempt rational proofs of God's existence. Aquinas's 5 ways, Anselm's ontological argument, Kant's moral proof, all try to demonstrate that reason itself requires religious belief. Dostoyevsky suggests that faith and reason occupy different registers, that genuine faith emerges from existential need and personal encounter rather than logical demonstration. You can't argue someone into loving God any more than you can argue them into loving another person. Søren Kierkegaard's Night of Faith provides parallel to Dostoyevsky's approach. For Kierkegaard, genuine faith requires absurd leap beyond reason's limits. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac demonstrates faith in its pure form precisely because it contradicts ethical reason. Abraham can't explain or justify his actions rationally. He simply obeys God's command in defiance of everything reason demands. This absurdity is faith's essence, not accidental feature. Faith that could be rationally justified wouldn't be faith but knowledge. Dostoyevsky seems to accept this Kierkegaardian framework while exploring its psychological and ethical costs. The leap of faith isn't triumphant affirmation, but desperate gamble. You might land in authentic relationship with God, or you might simply deceive yourself with comforting illusion. There's no way to know in advance, no guarantee that faith represents genuine encounter rather than psychological defense mechanism. But refusing the leap means remaining in underground paralysis, where consciousness consumes itself without finding anything to believe in. The Karamazov family dramatizes this religious tension genealogically. The father Fyodor represents crude materialism and sensuality without any spiritual dimension. Ivan represents intellectual sophistication that leads to nihilistic rebellion. Dmitri represents passionate nature, seeking redemption through suffering. Alyosha represents faith maintained through love and spiritual discipline. Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son, represents what happens when Ivan's ideas filter down to someone without intellectual sophistication, producing monstrous results. The genealogical structure suggests that religious question can't be resolved individually, but plays out across generations and within families. Each person inherits spiritual problems from their parents, while creating new problems for their children. Ivan's atheism emerges partly from his father's spiritual emptiness. Smerdyakov's murder implements ideas he learned from Ivan. Alyosha's faith develops in reaction to his family's dysfunction. No one chooses their relationship to God from neutral position. We're always already situated in history and family that shapes what seems possible or necessary. Paul Tillich's concept of God as ground of being offers framework for understanding what Dostoyevsky's characters seek when they seek God. Tillich argued that God isn't being among beings, supernatural entity existing somewhere beyond natural world. God is being itself, the ground and power of existence. To have faith isn't to believe in particular supernatural person, but to trust in being despite non-being's threat. Anxiety emerges from awareness that we might not be, that non-being constantly threatens. Faith is courage to affirm existence despite this threat. This framework helps make sense of why Dostoyevsky's atheist characters seem to need God, even while rejecting him. Ivan doesn't simply disbelieve in supernatural being. He rebels against ground of existence itself, rejects cosmos that permits innocent suffering. His atheism isn't intellectual position about evidence, but moral protest against being. Similarly, the underground man's paralysis stems from inability to find ground, his consciousness floating without purchase on reality. Faith for these characters would mean discovering basis for existence that makes it bearable, not accepting particular theological propositions. But Tillich's abstract ground of being might miss the personal dimension essential to Dostoyevsky's religious vision. His characters don't seek impersonal metaphysical ground. They need personal God who sees them, loves them, justifies their existence through relationship. Alyosha's faith centers on Christ as person, not being itself. Sonia's faith finds expression in reading Gospels about Jesus raising Lazarus, concrete narrative of individuals saved through divine love. The abstraction of philosophical theology might fail to address what humans actually need when they need God. Lev Shestov, Russian religious philosopher, deeply influenced by Dostoyevsky, argued that reason and faith represent fundamentally opposed modes of relationship to reality. Reason seeks universal principles, necessary connections, logical coherence. Faith recognizes that ultimate reality transcends rational categories, that God's freedom means anything is possible. The conflict between Athens, philosophy, and Jerusalem, revelation, can't be resolved through synthesis. We must choose between them, and choosing faith means accepting absurdity that reason cannot tolerate. Shestov read Dostoyevsky's Underground Man as exemplifying consciousness that is seen through reason without finding faith. The Underground Man recognizes that rational principles don't capture reality's depth, that twice two making four represents deadly constraint rather than liberating truth. But he can't access faith that would free him from reason's tyranny. He's suspended between discredited reason and inaccessible faith, suffering from inability to commit to either. His tragedy demonstrates what happens when someone needs faith but can't achieve it. The problem of evil returns here with renewed force. If faith means trusting in ground of being despite suffering, accepting that God's ways exceed our understanding, then faith requires submitting to what Ivan calls injustice. You must accept that children's torture somehow fits into divine plan, that innocent suffering serves purposes you can't comprehend. This seems to require betraying moral insight for sake of religious comfort. Dostoyevsky never resolves this tension between moral clarity and religious faith. Father Zosima's teaching that everyone is responsible for everyone might offer path beyond this impasse. Instead of asking whether God justifies suffering, we might ask how we respond to suffering we encounter. Universal responsibility shifts focus from theodicy to ethics, from explaining evil to fighting it. If I'm responsible for every child's suffering, then my task isn't justifying God, but working to prevent suffering. Faith becomes practical commitment to love rather than theoretical position about evil's metaphysical status. But does this resolve Ivan's protest? Even if we accept universal responsibility and work to reduce suffering, the fact remains that God created a world where such suffering occurs. Our ethical response doesn't justify God's initial creation of system requiring such response. We're still trapped in cosmos that seems designed to produce pain. Zosima's ethical vision provides way to live with this reality without justifying the reality itself. Part 7. The Double. Dostoyevsky's novella. The Double presents his most psychologically penetrating analysis of identity's fragility. Golyatkin, minor civil servant, begins encountering his exact double, who behaves in ways that simultaneously attract and repel him. The double is everything Golyatkin wishes he could be: confident, socially successful, morally unscrupulous. But the double's success comes through violating principles Golyatkin can't quite abandon. The story becomes nightmarish descent into madness as Golyatkin loses capacity to distinguish himself from his double or reality from hallucination. The double represents split within consciousness that modernity intensifies. We contain multiple selves with contradictory desires and values. The social self wants acceptance and success. The moral self insists on integrity and principle. The authentic self seeks genuine expression. The prudent self counsels caution and conformity. These selves don't form coherent unity, but pull in different directions, creating internal civil war. The double makes this internal conflict external, showing Golyatkin fighting himself literally rather than metaphorically. This anticipates Freud's structural model of mind divided between ID, ego, and superego. Id contains amoral drives seeking immediate satisfaction. Superego embodies internalized parental and social prohibitions. Ego attempts to mediate between these opposing forces while navigating external reality. Mental health requires maintaining balance between these structures. Neurosis emerges when conflict becomes too intense for ego to manage. Golyatkin's double represents ID breaking free from superego's constraints, acting out desires ego had repressed. But Dostoyevsky's analysis differs from Freud's in crucial respect. Freud treats psychic division as universal human condition manageable through proper ego development. Dostoyevsky suggests that modern consciousness specifically intensifies this division to pathological degree. Traditional societies provided clear roles and stable values that integrated personality. Modern atomization and moral pluralism splinter personality into contradictory fragments without providing integration principle. The problem isn't internal conflict as such, but modernity's elimination of resources for resolving conflict. Carl Jung's concept of shadow provides alternative framework. The shadow contains aspects of personality we reject or deny, qualities incompatible with ego's self-conception. These rejected qualities don't disappear, but operate unconsciously, influencing behavior in ways we don't recognize. Psychological health requires acknowledging and integrating shadow, rather than projecting it onto others or denying its existence. Golyatkin's double is shadow made visible, forcing him to confront what he's tried to exile from consciousness. The Jungian reading suggests that Golyatkin's madness stems from failed integration. Rather than recognizing that the double represents his own rejected possibilities, he treats it as external enemy. This projection prevents growth because he fights himself as if fighting another person. Successful integration would require acknowledging that he contains both his current timid personality and his double's boldness, that these aren't alternatives, but aspects of single self-requiring synthesis. But can such integration actually occur? Dostoyevsky seems skeptical. The qualities Golyatkin rejects aren't just shadow aspects requiring acknowledgement. They're genuinely incompatible values. You can't simultaneously maintain moral integrity and achieve worldly success through deception. You can't be authentically yourself and skillfully perform social roles. The contradiction isn't resolvable through psychological integration because it reflects genuine conflict between incommensurable goods. Modern life demands incompatible things from us, and no amount of self-awareness resolves this. Irving Goffman's dramaturgical approach to self illuminates different dimension of doubling. Goffman argued that we constantly perform different selves depending on social context, managing impressions we make on others through strategic self-presentation. The self isn't unified essence, but series of performances adapted to different audiences. This isn't deception, but normal social functioning. Problems arise when we believe our performances constitute authentic self, or when different performances contradict so thoroughly that we lose sense of continuity. Golyatkin's crisis stems from this performance, multiplicity becoming conscious and unbearable. He's aware that he performs different selves in different contexts, that none of these performances feels entirely authentic. His double represents ideal performance, self-perfectly adapted to social demands. But acknowledging this ideal means recognizing that his current self is also performance, that there's no authentic Golyadkin beneath the masks. This recognition triggers psychotic break because it dissolves identity's phenomenological ground. The question becomes whether unified self is achievable ideal or metaphysical fiction. Traditional view holds that beneath surface variations, continuous self persists across time and contexts. This self might be soul, or consciousness, or narrative identity threading experiences together. But what if no such unity exists? What if personality is just loosely connected bundle of habits, reactions, and performances without essential core? Golyadkin's madness might reveal truth about selfhood that stable people successfully ignore. Derek Parfit's reductionist view of personal identity argues that self is not deep fact, but conventional construct. What matters for identity isn't some metaphysical entity persisting through change, but continuity of psychological connections, memories, intentions, character traits. These connections come in degrees. We're more or less the same person over time, depending on strength of connections. This suggests that questions about identity often lack determinate answers because they presuppose unified self that doesn't exist. Applied to Golyadkin, Parfitian analysis suggests his crisis stems from discovering reductionist truth about identity. He recognizes that nothing unifies his various selves, that Golyadkin is just name applied to series of related but distinct psychological states. His double represents acknowledgement that he could become entirely different person while maintaining enough continuity to still be called Golyadkin. This realization is psychologically devastating, even if metaphysically accurate. Dostoyevsky's exploration of doubling extends beyond individual psychology to social and political dimensions. The double appears when social structures demand conformity while promising individual freedom. We're told to be ourselves while being evaluated constantly on how well we perform expected roles. We're encouraged to pursue authentic desires while being shaped by forces beyond our control. This creates generalized doubling, where everyone performs self they're supposed to be, while suspecting that performance isn't real. The Grand Inquisitor's argument returns in this context. He claims humans don't want freedom, but security and clear direction. Golyadkin demonstrates what happens when someone receives freedom he can't handle. He splits into multiple selves because he has no stable ground for unified identity. His double succeeds socially by abandoning authentic self-determination, simply performing whatever each context demands. The story suggests that either we accept doubling as necessary social strategy, or we go mad, trying to maintain impossible unity. But Dostoyevsky doesn't endorse the Inquisitor's conclusion, even while showing its appeal. Golyadkin's madness is tragedy, not inevitable outcome of freedom. The possibility remains that some people achieve genuine selfhood despite social pressures toward performance and fragmentation. The novels don't show such achievement clearly, but they don't rule it out. Characters like Alyosha and Sonia maintain integrity without going mad, suggesting that faith or love might provide integration that reason and social success cannot. Part 8. The Dialectic of Freedom and Authority. The Brothers. Karamazov stages dialectical conflict between freedom and authority across across multiple registers simultaneously. Ivan's rebellion represents freedom's demand for autonomy against any external authority. The Grand Inquisitor represents authority's claim to provide security and meaning. Dmitri embodies passionate freedom that leads to chaos. Alyosha represents free submission to spiritual authority. These positions don't resolve into neat synthesis, but circle around irresolvable tension at heart of human existence. The conflict appears most sharply in relationship to Father Karamazov. All three legitimate sons hate him, but respond differently to that hatred. Dmitri's passionate nature leads him to threaten murder openly, expressing rage without restraint. Ivan's intellectual rebellion refuses to acknowledge any paternal authority, but can't bring himself to direct action. Alyosha loves everyone, including his father, despite recognizing his moral corruption. Smerdyakov, illegitimate son, actually commits the murder, implementing Ivan's ideas while exposing their consequence. The father represents authority in its most degraded form: corrupt, arbitrary, self-serving. He has legal and traditional authority over his sons, but no moral legitimacy. This makes the question of obedience acute. Should sons obey someone simply because he's father, regardless of his character? Or does authority require justification beyond mere position? The novel explores these questions without providing simple answers, showing both the dangers of unqualified authority and the chaos of complete freedom from it. Hegel's master-slave dialectic provides framework for analyzing this relationship. Master depends on slave for recognition of his mastery, while slave's consciousness develops through labor under master's domination. Eventually, slave achieves self-consciousness unavailable to master whose identity depends entirely on domination. The dialectic progresses toward mutual recognition, where neither party is master or slave, but both recognize each other as free and equal subjects. Applied to Karamazov family, Fyodor represents master, whose identity depends on dominating his sons. But his mastery is hollow because he's morally degraded, commanding no genuine respect. His sons are slaves who must develop consciousness through struggle with paternal authority. Ivan's intellectual rebellion and Dmitri's passionate resistance represent different moments in this struggle. But the dialectic doesn't progress to mutual recognition because Fyodor is incapable of recognizing others as free subjects. His death prevents resolution while exposing the violence inherent in relationships structured by domination. Alexandra Kojeve's reading of Hegel emphasizes recognition's centrality to human existence. We become human not through rational thought, but through desire for recognition from other self-consciousnesses. This desire drives history as individuals and groups fight for recognition of their humanity. Master-slave dialectic represents this struggle's basic structure. Eventually, universal homogeneous state achieves mutual recognition for everyone, ending history because fundamental human desire has been satisfied. But Dostoyevsky suggests that recognition can't be compelled through dialectical struggle. Ivan might rebel against his father and demand recognition as free rational subject. But such recognition, even if achieved, wouldn't satisfy because it comes from struggle rather than love. Genuine recognition must be freely given gift, not concession extracted through conflict. This is why Alyosha's path differs from his brothers. He doesn't fight for recognition, but offers it unconditionally. And paradoxically, this makes him more free than his rebellious brothers. The monastery represents alternative form of authority grounded in spiritual rather than paternal or political power. Father Zosima has authority over monks, including Alyosha, but this authority operates through love and example rather than coercion. Monks obey freely, submitting to monastic discipline as means to spiritual freedom. This suggests that problem isn't authority as such, but particular forms of authority that dominate rather than liberate. But Ivan would reject this distinction as illusory. Any authority, even spiritual, constrains freedom by demanding obedience to standards originating outside individual will. The fact that submission feels voluntary doesn't make it actual freedom. Monks who happily obey might be most thoroughly enslaved precisely because they've internalized their chains. True freedom requires throwing off all external authority, whether corrupt father or loving spiritual guide. Nothing should have power over autonomous individual. This radical freedom appears in Ivan's poem about the Grand Inquisitor, but also in his relationship to Smerdyakov. Ivan tells Smerdyakov that everything is permitted if God doesn't exist. He means this as intellectual proposition, philosophical implication of atheism. But Smerdyakov takes it literally as permission to murder. When Ivan learns that his intellectual rebellion has practical consequences, he experiences catastrophic guilt. His freedom philosophy produced murderous unfreedom in someone less sophisticated. This raises question whether intellectual freedom can be pursued responsibly in a world where ideas have consequences. Ivan wants freedom to think anything without being responsible for what others do with those thoughts. But Dostoyevsky suggests this is impossible. Ideas aren't private possessions, but social facts that shape reality through influencing action. Freedom to think carries responsibility for thought's effects. Ivan's tragedy is discovering that pure intellectual rebellion doesn't exist, that his ideas became instruments others used for purposes he didn't intend. Mikhail Bakunin's anarchist philosophy represents logical extreme of freedom against authority. Bakunin argued that all authority is oppressive, that hierarchy itself is violence regardless of content. Freedom requires destroying every institution claiming authority over individuals, state, church, family, law. Only in stateless society of voluntary cooperation can humans flourish. Destruction of authority is liberation, not chaos. Natural human sociability provides sufficient basis for order once artificial constraints are removed. Dostoyevsky knew Bakunin personally and portrayed him in The Possessed through character Verkovensky. But he saw anarchist freedom as producing terror rather than liberation. Without any authority, without shared principles or institutional constraints, society dissolves into war of all against all, where strongest or most ruthless dominate. The revolutionaries in The Possessed murder, manipulate, and destroy in name of freedom, but create only nihilistic chaos. Their liberation is simply negation without positive vision of what free society would look like. But does this refute anarchism, or simply show its corruption by particular individuals? Perhaps genuine anarchist freedom requires moral development and social conditions that weren't present in Dostoevsky's Russia. Bakunin might argue that Verkovensky represents false anarchism, power-seeking nihilism masquerading as liberation. True anarchism would emerge organically from people prepared to live without authority, not be imposed through revolutionary violence. Dostoevsky remains skeptical that such preparation is possible. Humans seem to need authority, structure, stable meaning frameworks. Complete freedom produces anxiety and disintegration rather than flourishing. But corrupt authority produces suffering and degradation. The dialectic between freedom and authority doesn't resolve into synthesis because both poles contain partial truth. We need freedom to be fully human, but we also need authority to avoid chaos. The task is finding forms of authority compatible with freedom, not eliminating authority entirely. Part 9. Suffering as transformation. Dostoyevsky's novels repeatedly present suffering as necessary for moral and spiritual development. Raskolnikov redeems himself through years of prison suffering. Dmitry Karamazov embraces his unjust sentence as opportunity for spiritual transformation. Sonia's degrading prostitution purifies rather than corrupts her. This pattern seems to endorse suffering as positive good, as if pain itself has redemptive power. But the relationship between suffering and transformation is more complex than simple endorsement suggests. The key distinction is between suffering that destroys and suffering that transforms. Not all pain ennobles. The characters who find redemption through suffering approach it with particular attitude, acceptance, willingness to bear it without bitterness, recognition that they deserve punishment even when external judgment seems unjust. This attitude transforms suffering from mere pain into spiritual discipline. Without such attitude, suffering simply crushes personality without enabling growth. This connects to Christian theology of redemptive suffering. Christ's passion demonstrates that innocent suffering can have meaning through freely accepting it out of love. The crucifixion isn't just historical event, but eternal pattern, showing how suffering can be transformed into salvation. Christians are called to take up their crosses, to embrace unavoidable suffering as participation in Christ's redemptive work. Dostoyevsky draws heavily on this theological tradition while exploring its psychological and ethical dimensions. But this theology of suffering faces serious objections. It can romanticize pain, suggesting that suffering is good rather than evil to be minimized. It can encourage passivity in face of injustice. If suffering redeems, why work to eliminate it? It can blame victims for failing to be transformed by suffering, as if problem is their attitude rather than the suffering itself. These dangers make any celebration of suffering morally problematic. Dostoyevsky seems aware of these dangers without fully resolving them. He doesn't suggest that all suffering should be welcomed, or that pain is good in itself. Rather, he observes that given the inevitability of suffering, some responses to it enable growth, while others produce only bitterness and destruction. Since we can't avoid suffering, the question becomes how to bear it without being destroyed. This pragmatic focus differs from philosophical justification of suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, provides parallel but distinct approach to suffering. Nietzsche argued that we should affirm everything in our lives, including pain and tragedy, not despite these elements, but because of them. We should will eternal return of our exact life with all its suffering. This affirmation doesn't claim suffering is secretly good or serves hidden purpose. It simply says that truly strong person embraces reality as it is rather than wishing for different reality. Dostoyevsky's characters never achieve this Nietzschean affirmation. They don't love their suffering, but endure it. They don't will eternal return, but hope for redemption that ends pain. Where Nietzsche celebrates tragic joy, Dostoyevsky presents suffering accepted in hope of transformation. The difference reflects deeper disagreement about suffering's meaning. Nietzsche sees suffering as neutral fact requiring affirmation. Dostoyevsky sees suffering as evil requiring redemption. Simone Weil's concept of affliction provides remarkably precise analysis of suffering's transformative potential. We'll distinguish between suffering and affliction. Suffering is pain, physical or psychological. Affliction is suffering that reaches into soul, destroying social identity and sense of self-worth. Affliction makes person feel they deserve their suffering, that they're worthless. This social death is affliction's essence, not just pain, but degradation that strips away everything giving life meaning. We'll argue that affliction, precisely because it destroys everything, creates possibility for genuine transformation. When all social supports and psychological defenses collapse, person confronts their own nothingness. This confrontation can lead to authentic relationship with God because it removes all mediating structures. In affliction, we encounter God directly or not at all. The transformation is grace, not natural process, but affliction creates opening for grace by destroying everything that blocked it. Dostoyevsky's portrayal of Sonia's redemptive suffering closely parallels Weil's analysis. Prostitution subjects Sonia to social death, degradation that strips away respectable identity. Yet precisely this affliction enables her genuine faith and capacity for selfless love. She has nothing left to lose, no social standing to protect, no illusions about her virtue. This makes her freer than respectable people who maintain their self-image through denying reality. Her affliction purifies by destroying false self. But does affliction necessarily transform, or can it simply destroy? Will acknowledges that most afflicted people are simply crushed, that transformation is rare grace rather than predictable outcome. Dostoyevsky's novels show both patterns. Some characters find redemption through suffering, while others become bitter, vindictive, or mad. Suffering doesn't automatically ennoble. It provides possibility for transformation that requires something beyond suffering itself. Grace, love, or at minimum, willingness to remain open to meaning. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, developed from his concentration camp experience, offers psychological framework for understanding suffering's transformative potential. Frankl argued that meaning, not pleasure or power, is primary human motivation. We can endure almost anything if we find meaning in it. Suffering becomes unbearable, not because of pain intensity, but because it seems pointless. Finding meaning in suffering transforms it from mere anguish into purposeful ordeal, enabling growth. This connects to Dostoevsky's emphasis on accepting suffering rather than simply enduring it. Acceptance involves finding some meaning or purpose in pain, even if that meaning is just opportunity for spiritual development. Raskolnikov's suffering in prison becomes bearable once he begins to see it as deserved punishment and chance for moral regeneration. Before acceptance, prison is just torment. After acceptance, it becomes purgatory, painful but purposeful passage toward better self. But logotherapy's emphasis on finding meaning might miss something in Dostoevsky's vision. His characters don't find meaning through rational reflection or choosing interpretive framework. Meaning comes to them through love, through relationships that make suffering bearable. Sonia's love for Raskolnikov transforms his suffering by providing concrete reason to continue. He endures not because he's found abstract meaning, but because specific person cares whether he lives or dies. Meaning is relational gift rather than cognitive achievement. The question remains whether suffering is necessary for transformation or whether it's simply unavoidable condition requiring response. Dostoyevsky sometimes suggests the former, that pain itself has purifying power. More often, he shows that suffering creates crisis, forcing choice between bitterness and acceptance, between closing heart against pain and opening it despite pain. The transformation happens through the choice, not through suffering itself. Suffering is occasion for choice, not sufficient cause of transformation. Part 10. The Scandal of Particularity. Dostoevsky's religious vision centers on Christ's incarnation as particular historical person rather than universal rational truth. This creates what theologians call scandal of particularity. Ultimate truth is tied to specific individual who lived at particular time and place. Christianity doesn't offer philosophical system or ethical principles accessible to all through reason. It offers relationship with Jesus Christ that requires faith in his historical existence and present spiritual reality. This particularity offends modern sensibility that seeks universal truth, independent of accidents of history. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion partly stems from inability to accept this particularity. He seeks universal rational morality applicable to everyone, regardless of historical circumstance. But Christianity insists that salvation comes through relationship with specific person, that no rational system can substitute for personal encounter with Christ. This seems arbitrary, making salvation dependent on historical accident of when and where you're born. How is it fair that people born before Christ or far from Christian influence lack access to redemptive relationship? The scandal intensifies when considering Christian claims about Christ's uniqueness. He's not just exemplary teacher or prophet, but God incarnate, second person of Trinity. This makes him qualitatively different from other religious figures. But why should unique revelation come through obscure carpenter in first-century Palestine rather than through more universal means? The particularity seems incompatible with God's universal love, suggesting either God is unfair or Christian claims are false. Hegel's Christology attempts to resolve this scandal through dialectical philosophy. Hegel argued that incarnation represents necessary moment in spirit's self-realization. God must become particular individual to achieve complete self-consciousness. The infinite must enter finite existence to recognize itself in its own otherness. Christ isn't arbitrary, particular, but logical necessity for spirit achieving absolute knowledge. This philosophical interpretation supposedly makes incarnation universally comprehensible, rather than offensive particularity requiring blind faith. But Dostoevsky rejects this Hegelian universalization. Reducing Christ to moment in spirit's dialectic eliminates precisely what makes Christianity powerful: personal relationship with specific individual who suffered, died, and loves us. Hegelian system makes incarnation necessary but abstract, losing the concrete historical reality of Jesus as actual person. For Dostoevsky, faith means commitment to this particular person, not acceptance of philosophical system explaining incarnation's logical necessity. Søren Kierkegaard's concept of absolute paradox provides alternative framework that embraces rather than resolves particularity's scandal. Kierkegaard argued that incarnation is absurd to reason. Eternal entering time, infinite becoming finite, God becoming human. This absurdity can't be rationalized or explained. We must accept it through leap of faith that defies rational comprehension. The scandal is essential to Christianity, not problem requiring philosophical solution. Faith begins where reason ends, with acceptance of what reason finds impossible. Dostoyevsky's Christ figure in The Idiot, Prince Mishkin, embodies this paradoxical particularity. Mishkin is simple, innocent, epileptic. He loves everyone unconditionally, forgives immediately, sees only good in people. His Christ-like qualities manifest through specific personality shaped by illness and experience. He's not universal rational principle, but particular person whose very peculiarity makes him window to divine love. Yet this same particularity makes him incomprehensible to normal society. His goodness appears as illness, his love as weakness. The contrast with Nietzsche's Übermensch illuminates different visions of human excellence. Nietzsche's Übermensch is powerful creator of values, master who transcends conventional morality through strength of will. Mishkin embodies opposite, weakness, vulnerability, inability to impose his will on anything. Yet Dostoevsky suggests this weakness contains strength inaccessible to Nietzschean power. Mishkin's vulnerable love transforms those who encounter it more profoundly than any domination could. But Mishkin's ultimate failure complicates simple identification with Christ. He can't save anyone despite his love. His presence doesn't redeem the world, but seems to make things worse. By novel's end, he's returned to idiocy, having sparked tragedy rather than salvation. This suggests that Christ-like love in fallen world leads to destruction, that emulating Christ without Christ's divine nature and resurrection is impossible or catastrophic. The question becomes whether Christianity requires literal belief in Christ's historical existence and divine nature, or whether it can be read as existential truth expressible through symbols and stories. Rudolf Bultmann's demythologization program argued for latter, claiming that supernatural elements in gospel aren't facts requiring belief, but existential meanings requiring appropriation. Christ's resurrection symbolizes possibility of authentic existence arising from death of inauthentic self. Dostoevsky would reject this demythologization completely. His faith centers precisely on literal historical reality of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Remove supernatural elements, and Christianity becomes just ethical teaching or psychological insight. But for Dostoevsky, Christianity's power lies exactly in its impossible claims that God became human, died, and rose bodily. These claims can't be reduced to existential meanings without eliminating what makes Christianity unique and transformative. The scandal of particularity thus remains unresolved in Dostoevsky's work. He acknowledges that Christian claims seem arbitrary and offensive to reason. He creates characters, like Ivan, who articulate this offense powerfully. But he also insists that genuine faith requires accepting the scandal, embracing particular historical revelation rather than seeking universal rational truth. This isn't philosophical argument, but testimony from someone who has staked everything on this particular person while remaining acutely aware of how absurd that stake appears. Part 11. The Demons. The possessed, also translated as demons or devils, presents Dostoevsky's most direct engagement with revolutionary politics and nihilistic philosophy. Based on actual political murders in Russia, the novel portrays revolutionary cell-planning terrorism to destabilize existing order. But the revolutionaries aren't idealistic reformers. They're nihilists pursuing destruction for its own sake, power seekers using revolutionary rhetoric to justify violence. Dostoyevsky unmasks revolutionary idealism as disguised will to power, showing how abstract ideas about justice and freedom become instruments for cruelty. Verkovensky represents pure revolutionary spirit. Everything must be destroyed to create new world. He claims to serve future utopia, but clearly enjoys destruction itself. The revolution is means to power and outlet for violence rather than genuine commitment to improving human life. He manipulates others through their idealism, exploiting their desire for meaning and purpose while remaining cynically detached himself. This creates structure of revolutionary movement. True believers at bottom, cynical operators at top, all united in assault on existing order. Stavrogin, the novel's enigmatic center, embodies exhausted consciousness that has passed through all possible beliefs and found nothing worth believing. He's tried Christianity and atheism, morality and nihilism, aesthetic refinement and crude sensuality. Each position proved as arbitrary as any other. This absolute relativism produces paralysis deeper than underground man's. Stavrogin can't even maintain clear atheism because that would be commitment. He drifts through life without conviction or passion, unable to care about anything. This portrait anticipates Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism as modern condition. Nietzsche distinguished between passive and active nihilism. Passive nihilism recognizes meaninglessness and responds with exhaustion, giving up on life because nothing matters. Active nihilism recognizes meaninglessness and responds with destruction, clearing away old values to enable new creation. Stavrogin exemplifies passive nihilism in its purest form. He sees through everything, but can't create anything new. His inability to believe paralyzes him completely. The connection to Nietzsche runs deeper because Dostoyevsky anticipates Nietzsche's genealogical analysis of morality. The Possessed shows how Christian morality becomes inverted into revolutionary morality without losing its essential structure. Revolutionaries claim to serve justice, equality, and human dignity just as Christians did. But these values now justify violence against those labeled oppressors. The inversion maintains moral absolutism while reversing its content. Dostoyevsky recognized that revolutionary movements were secularized Christianity, not its opposite. But where Nietzsche celebrated this inversion as necessary for overcoming slave morality, Dostoyevsky saw it as catastrophe. He argued that eliminating Christianity's transcendent ground while maintaining its moral absolutism produces fanaticism without restraint. If there's no God to judge us, we're free to inflict any suffering in service of earthly justice. Revolutionary morality becomes more oppressive than traditional morality because it lacks transcendent check on human judgment. The character Kirillov demonstrates logical extreme of nihilistic freedom. He reasons that if God doesn't exist, then humans are God. To prove this divine freedom, he must overcome fear of death by committing suicide, not from despair, but from philosophical necessity. Killing himself demonstrates that death has no power over self-willed individual. He plans his suicide methodically, convinced this act will transform humanity by proving humans are free from all constraint, including fear of non-existence. This represents Nietzschean logic, taken to conclusion Nietzsche didn't reach. If God is dead, and we must create our own values, then ultimate value is demonstrating absolute freedom through confronting death without fear. Kirillov's suicide is philosophical act, proof that nothing transcends human will. But Dostoyevsky shows this logic as mad. Killing yourself to prove freedom demonstrates freedom's opposite: slavery to abstract idea. Real freedom would be living despite death's absurdity, not fleeing into death to prove philosophical point. Hannah Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism illuminates political dimension of Dostoevsky's portrait of revolutionary nihilism. Arendt argued that totalitarian movements attract mass support by offering total explanation of history and clear enemies to blame. Movements promise to realize historical necessity, to create perfect society by eliminating obstacles. This utopian vision requires treating humans as raw material to be shaped by revolutionary violence. Individual persons matter only as means to collective end. The possessed demonstrates this logic forming in revolutionary cell. Verkovensky creates enemies through false accusations, using invented conspiracies to unify group through shared paranoia. He promises future paradise while demanding present sacrifices. Most ominously, he argues that millions might need to die to achieve utopia, that this mass murder would be justified by final result. Dostoevsky recognized totalitarian logic before totalitarian states realized it historically. But the novel also portrays religious characters who resist revolutionary nihilism without offering simple conservative alternative. Shadov represents passionate Slavophile nationalism, belief in Russian Orthodox Christianity as path for humanity. But his faith is more emotional than theological, rooted in need for belonging rather than clear conviction. When confronted with actual theological questions, he admits uncertainty. This suggests that resistance to nihilism requires something more than nationalism or cultural Christianity. The Virgin Mary's appearance to Stavrogin represents possibility of grace breaking through nihilistic paralysis. In his confession, Stavrogin describes mystical vision where he saw Mary and felt momentary peace. But the moment passed, leaving him in familiar emptiness. He can't maintain religious faith even after mystical experience because his consciousness immediately analyzes and dissolves any conviction. Grace touches him without transforming him, suggesting that psychological damage can become so complete that even divine intervention finds no purchase. This raises terrible question about salvation's limits. If someone has passed through all possible beliefs and found nothing, if consciousness has become so self-aware that it undermines every commitment, can they be saved? Dostoevsky offers no clear answer. Stavrogin commits suicide, rejecting salvation's possibility. But the question remains whether this represents his choice or his fate, whether someone in his condition could have chosen differently. The novel's title refers to gospel story, where Jesus casts demons from possessed man into swine who rush into sea. The epilogue suggests that revolutionaries are demons possessing Russia, that they'll eventually destroy themselves as demons destroyed swine. This provides religious interpretation of revolutionary movement, spiritual disease rather than political phenomenon. But this interpretation risks dismissing genuine grievances that fuel revolutionary sentiment. Are revolutionaries simply possessed, or do they respond to real injustices? Dostoevsky seems to acknowledge both. Revolutionary movement feeds on legitimate suffering and inequality. But revolutionary response to these problems makes everything worse rather than better. It replaces real but limited suffering with apocalyptic violence, claiming to eliminate suffering forever. The proper response to injustice is reform, compassion, and gradual improvement, not total destruction and reconstruction. His conservatism stems from recognizing that revolutionary cure is worse than disease. Part 12. Dostoyevsky's legacy. Dostoyevsky's influence on 20th century philosophy and literature is immeasurable. Existentialism, from Kierkegaard through Sartre, draws heavily on his psychological insights. Freud acknowledged him as fellow explorer of unconscious depths. Nietzsche read him carefully, despite disagreeing with his conclusions. Camus centered his philosophy of absurdity on response to Dostoyevskian questions. Almost every major thinker engaging human consciousness's dark regions owes debt to Dostoyevsky's unflinching analysis. The existentialists found in Dostoyevsky literary demonstration of their philosophical concepts. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety and despair, Heidegger's portrait of inauthentic existence, Sartre's concept of bad faith, all appear in crystalline form in Dostoyevsky's characters. But Dostoyevsky provided something philosophers often lack: concrete phenomenological descriptions showing how abstract concepts manifest in lived experience. The underground man doesn't illustrate bad faith. He is bad faith, showing what that philosophical concept actually feels like from inside. Jean-Paul Sartre engaged directly with Dostoyevsky in his critical writings and incorporated Dostoyevskian themes throughout his philosophical fiction. Nausea presents consciousness confronting existence's contingency, experiencing same vertigo underground man described. No Exit dramatizes how we're trapped by others' perceptions, unable to define ourselves independently. But Sartre rejected Dostoyevsky's religious solution, arguing that we must create meaning without God, rather than seeking redemption through faith. This difference reflects broader existentialism split between religious and atheistic branches. Kierkegaard and Gabriel Marcel developed Christian existentialism that accepts Dostoyevskian insights about consciousness's burden while affirming faith as authentic response. Sartre and Camus represent atheistic existentialism that acknowledges same burden but rejects religious consolation as bad faith. Both branches recognize Dostoyevsky as accurately diagnosing modern consciousness's condition, even while disagreeing about proper response. Mikhail Bakhtin's literary theory developed through extensive analysis of Dostoyevsky's novels. Bakhtin argued that Dostoyevsky invented polyphonic novel, form where multiple consciousnesses interact without author imposing single truth. Each character represents complete worldview that isn't reduced to illustration of author's position. This creates genuine dialogue where ideas clash without predetermined resolution. Bakhtin saw this as revolutionizing novel form and modeling more democratic approach to truth. But does Dostoyevsky actually achieve polyphony, or does he manipulate dialogue to favor Christian position? Critics argue that supposedly equal voices aren't actually equal. Atheist characters suffer and fail while believers find peace. Ivan goes mad while Alyosha thrives. This pattern suggests authorial judgment despite dialogic form. Bakhtin might respond that suffering doesn't determine which position is true. Ivan's arguments remain powerful regardless of his fate, creating genuine tension without resolution. Contemporary neuroscience and psychology increasingly validate Dostoyevsky's insights about consciousness's divided nature. Research on cognitive dissonance, self-deception, and motivated reasoning confirms that we're not unified rational agents, but conflicted systems. Default mode network studies show that self-referential thought often produces suffering rather than clarity. Consciousness emerges from competing brain processes that generate different motives and judgments. We are more like Dostoyevsky's divided characters than like Enlightenment's rational individual. But does scientific confirmation of psychological division help us? Knowing that we're neurologically conflicted doesn't resolve the conflict. Understanding brain mechanisms behind bad faith doesn't eliminate bad faith. Dostoyevsky showed that consciousness, knowing itself, doesn't liberate, but often increases suffering. Modern neuroscience might simply provide new vocabulary for describing same impossible situation consciousness faces. The question of whether Dostoyevsky's Christian faith successfully answers problems he articulated remains disputed. Sympathetic readers see his works demonstrating that religious faith provides genuine response to nihilistic despair. Faith isn't rational solution, but existential transformation, enabling life despite absurdity. Love anchored in God becomes possible when purely human love fails. This makes Christianity practical truth, even if not philosophically provable. Skeptical readers see Dostoyevsky's religious characters as weak and unconvincing compared to his rebels. The questions Ivan raises overwhelm the answers Zosima offers. The suffering described exceeds any theodicy's justification. The psychological insights into consciousness's burden seem more true than religious promises of redemption. On this reading, Dostoyevsky wanted to believe but couldn't, and his greatest characters embody his doubt rather than his faith. Perhaps both readings capture partial truth. Dostoyevsky genuinely believed in Christianity while recognizing that belief wasn't rationally justified. He chose Christ despite acknowledging that arguments against God might be stronger. This divided consciousness pervades his work, creating its power and complexity. He wrote from inside struggle between faith and doubt rather than from achieved resolution. This makes him more honest and ultimately more helpful than writers who pretend either that faith is easy or that atheism resolves everything. The contemporary relevance of Dostoyevsky's exploration of consciousness's burden becomes increasingly apparent. Modern life intensifies precisely the conditions he analyzed. Social media creates underground man's self-consciousness on mass scale, with everyone performing identity while analyzing that performance. Information overload prevents the focused attention that integrated selfhood requires. Moral relativism eliminates stable ground for values without providing freedom in its place. We're more like Dostoyevsky's paralyzed intellectuals than we want to admit. Digital technology creates possibility for pseudo-connection that actually increases isolation. We interact constantly through screens without genuine encounter. We share performances rather than actual selves. We accumulate likes and followers while remaining fundamentally alone. This produces exact alienation Dostoyevsky described, heightened self-consciousness that prevents authentic relationship. We watch ourselves living instead of simply living, and this watching prevents us from ever arriving at present moment. Political polarization mirrors the dialectic between freedom and authority Dostoyevsky explored. One side demands individual liberty without limitation, while others seek strong authority, promising security and meaning. Neither position seems satisfying on its own, yet synthesis appears impossible. We oscillate between anxious freedom and oppressive order without finding balance. Dostoyevsky's analysis of how Grand Inquisitor exploits this dilemma remains disturbingly prescient. The mental health crisis in developed nations might reflect consciousness burden becoming unsustainable for growing numbers of people. Depression, anxiety, and despair reach epidemic levels despite material prosperity. Therapy and medication help some, but don't address existential dimensions Dostoevsky identified. Perhaps we need not just better mental health treatment, but honest reckoning with consciousness's inherent difficulty. Dostoevsky never promised that awareness would be pleasant, only that it might lead somewhere true. Climate Crisis presents collective version of Ivan's rebellion against God's justice. We watch world burning while supposedly benevolent systems prove incapable of response adequate to threat. Future generations will suffer from decisions made before they existed, without consenting to their circumstances. This raises Dostoevskian questions about cosmic justice on unprecedented scale. If we can't justify creating beings who'll inherit catastrophic world, should we continue reproducing? The logic of Ivan's rebellion extends into domains Dostoevsky never imagined. Artificial intelligence development creates new version of consciousness burden. As we build machines that might achieve self-awareness, we risk reproducing our own predicament in silicon. Will AI consciousness suffer from same divisions and alienation? Could we create being whose awareness exceeds its purpose, trapped in digital underground? Or might machine consciousness avoid biological irrationality that makes human consciousness unbearable? These questions extend Dostoevsky's analysis into technological future. The enduring power of Dostoevsky's vision lies in refusing false consolation. He doesn't pretend consciousness is easy, or that suffering serves obvious purpose. He offers no rational system that resolves life's tensions. But he also doesn't surrender to nihilistic despair. His characters struggle desperately with impossible situations, and some find ways to live despite impossibility. Not through intellectual solutions, but through love, faith, and human connection that can't be rationally justified, but make life bearable anyway. Perhaps this is Dostoevsky's ultimate legacy, showing that consciousness is burden we can neither escape nor fully bear, yet somehow we continue. We remain divided against ourselves, unable to achieve unity through reason or will. We suffer from awareness that exceeds our capacity to process what we're aware of. We create meanings while suspecting those meanings are arbitrary. Yet we love, believe, hope, and act despite knowing that love, belief, hope, and action lack ultimate foundation. This is not solution, but description of human condition in its fullness. And somehow, for some of us, description itself provides strange comfort. We're not alone in impossibility. We're together in recognizing what can't be resolved, but must be lived.